replacement members. Rachel.
Thank you, Chairman. We have apologies from Jessica Leonard. Do you have any other apologies?
Okay, got declarations of interest. Then could I just ask for minutes of the previous meeting held on the 27th of November? These were circulated. Advance. A proposer. Yes. And have a second, and they are a true record of that meeting. Thank you, Andrew. Are there any matters arising that will be covered in the agenda items to follow? Not seeing any. Rachel had no messages regarding that, Rachel. Thank you. I've got just one announcement to make, and that is that Alan Howell is standing down as a member of the forum. He has resigned his position as the governor of Sutton-on-Sea Primary School and therefore is no longer eligible to retain the seat of the forum. So I just wanted to extend forum's thanks to Alan for his contribution to this time. Thanks very much, Rachel. So if we can turn to item number 5, school funding arrangement. So this is Elizabeth. Thank you very much for your report. Do you want to take questions as we go through the report, or would you rather have those? Okay.
Update on affordability as we go through, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So the purpose of the report is to brief the forum on school funding arrangements for 2026-27. The DfE published the funding announcements on the 17th of December and stated the government has increased for schools funding by 1.7 billion, bringing the national total funding to 67 billion, of which 50.9 is allocated to mainstream schools. The national funding formula, introduced in 2018, remains unchanged in principle. Local authorities must continue to move closer to the national funding formula each year. The DfE has again tightened local flexibility, requiring any authority, I assume that's okay, not already mirroring the NFF, to bring local factor values at least 10% closer to national values. A significant national change affecting all local authorities is the temporary suspension of the high needs national funding formula for 26-27. Instead of calculating allocations based on updated formula factors, the DfE have simply rolled forward each local authority's 25-26 allocation. This results in a cash flat settlement for every local authority, including Lincolnshire, despite rising demand across the SEND system. Total high needs funding will be 12.2 billion, of which 12 billion is allocated directly to local authorities. As you'll be aware, the government intends to publish a schools white paper this spring, setting out major reforms to SEND and alternative provision. This is expected to have major long-term implications for local authorities, schools and the funding network. In December, the DfE announced they will allocate at least £3 billion in capital investment between 26-27 and 29-30 to deliver a further 50,000 specialist places. Finally, in the early year settlements continues to expand in terms of funding, and the DfE anticipates an additional 9.5 billion nationally, which is an over £1 billion increase. Lincolnshire's total dedicated schools grants will be £919 million across the 4 funding blocks as detailed on page 13. In terms of an overall assessment, although funding levels have increased, looking at the schools block, once previous separate grants have been incorporated, the schools block is increasing by just 1.5%. And what is right, it does not reflect the cost pressures facing schools. One of the biggest themes influencing the schools block is the continued reduction in the number of primary age pupils. From the October 25 census, 8,295 pupils left year 6 in the summer of 25, with only 6,826 joined in reception in September 2025. That gives a net reduction of 1,469 pupils and 1,154 fewer pupils across the primary sector. Using the primary unit of funding, this reduction equates to about a 7 million reduction in the schools block. Birth rates remain consistently low, and we do not anticipate that trend reversing. As you will appreciate, the cash flat settlement of the high needs funding adds even greater pressure to the high needs block. The reduction in pupil numbers in the primary sector will also impact the central school services block, resulting in a reduction of funding of approximately £50,000. I'll now go through each of these 4 blocks in a bit more detail. In the November meeting, we presented the notional allocations for the schools block, and these are detailed of the 4 blocks, and these are detailed in table 2 on page 15 in terms of our books and subs. Lincolnshire continues to have a growth policy as detailed on page 15, and our growth allocation is 1.715 million, which supports both what we call explicit growth, and that's funded through our growth policy, and what we call implicit growth, that is through a pupil count adjustment in our authority pro forma tool that is used to calculate school budgets. We again have a falling roles fund of 0.426 million. Request for falling roles funding will only be approved while there is a strong exceptional case, and that will have to be presented to a panel of members from the local authority. If we move now to the central school services block, as we've had in the November meeting, that will continue to consist of ongoing responsibilities and direct commitment funding. Similar to the schools block in 26-27, the allocation will include the incorporation of separate previous grants. Ongoing responsibilities, the funding due to the local authority will increase by 1.1% to 4.636 million, and historical funding commitment funding will continue to reduce by a further 20% to just over £500,000. Now looking at the high needs block, which remains our single greatest financial risk, Lincolnshire will see the cash flat settlement of £151 million in 26-27. This comes as national DSU deficits are forecast to reach 6.6 billion by the end of this financial year. The National Audit Office have raised concerns that increased funding across local authorities nationally has not delivered the proportional improvements in SEND outcomes. Lincolnshire, like many areas, is experiencing significant growth in demand for specialist SEND support, leading to rising costs and the projected structural deficit for the first time in 25-26, which members will be aware of from previous meetings. High needs spending is difficult to reduce quickly because it is driven by demand-led services. The government have extended the statutory DSG override until the end of 27-28, requiring councils to carry any DSG forward rather than offset against general funds. As part of the 2025 spending review, the government announced another £547 million in 26-27 and 230 million in 27-28 to support major SEND reforms, with further details expected in the forthcoming schools white paper. The DfE acknowledges that the rise in SEND demand and unsustainable DSG deficits are creating significant financial risk for councils nationally. Lincolnshire continues the transformational work through the inclusive ambition and better belonging strategy to strengthen mainstream inclusion and expand local SEND provision. To support financial sustainability, the schools forum agreed in the November meeting for a 0.5% schools block transfer to the high needs block to help manage pressures and invest in high need initiatives. The council will be reviewing EHC plan bandings, mainstream top-up funding and special schools funding for 26-27, supported by ongoing budget planning and engagement with the schools to secure a sustainable high need system. Turn next to the early years block. The total funding will be just short of £116 million, covering 7 areas of entitlement, including 9 months to 2-year-olds, 2-year-old disadvantaged, 3 and 4-year-olds universal and extended entitlement, maintain nursery school supplementary funding, early years pupil premium and DAF. And that will be covered more by Geraldine in the early years paper to follow. Pupil premium rates will continue in 26-27 with a 2.23% increase, and they are detailed on pages 19 and 20. Next to the schools budgets proposals, the council intends to continue to replicate national funding formula in 26-27, providing the schools block remains affordable, which I'll cover in more detail shortly. The information in terms of the formula remains unchanged from the November meeting and is detailed on pages 20 and 21. Key elements include all formula factors, excluding free school meals, increasing by 2.11%, with free school meals rising by 1.66%. Following the incorporation of the grants, the minimum per pupil funding levels will be 5,115 for primary schools and 6,640 for secondary schools. The minimum funding guarantee will be set at the highest possible value of 0%. And as we've already discussed, the schools block includes the proposal to transfer 0.5% to the higher needs block of £3.2 million. New formula factor values are detailed in Appendix A. In November, following the conversation with schools, the forum agreed to the approach of applying a downward adjustment to the ORPU values should affordability arise while replicating national funding formula. And we are now in a position to provide a verbal update. A word update will be provided in due course once everything's been finalised. So in terms of where we are with our authority pro forma tool, again, we have seen an increase in free school meals and free school meals over 6 eligibility of 2.5 and 2.78% respectively. When we compare eligibility of free school meals and free school meals over 6 compared to the size of the population, we've seen a 1.06 and 1.14 increase in eligibility, which is going to create a cost pressure of £2.354 million. Also in the primary sector, the number of children qualifying for low prior attainment has remained static, even though the number of children in the primary sector has decreased by 1,154 pupils. This therefore means a high proportion of the overall primary pupil numbers meeting the low prior attainment measure compared to the funding through the lagged funding arrangements and lower pupil numbers, and this is creating a cost pressure just under £500,000. So when we look at adopting national funding formula in entirety before looking at measures to address affordability in the schools block transfer, we have 14 schools receiving minimum per pupil funding. That's 17 less than last year, at an overall cost of just over £1 million. Last year that was 3.143 million. We now have 16 schools in receipt of minimum funding guarantee. That's 61 less than last year, and an overall cost of just over £120,000 compared to last year of just under £750,000. We do have an affordability shortfall of £3.315 million. So therefore, the local authority is unable to set an affordable formula. As agreed at the previous meetings, we are taking 2 steps in order to address that affordability gap. First is we have reviewed the school's growth and full enrolled budget, which was initially at 2.14 million, and we have reduced that to 1.319 million, looking at all of our commitments that we made for that pot. The remaining budget of 1.319 million will meet our financial commitments for primary and secondary organisations to ensure we fulfil our statutory duty. And then the remaining balance of 0.821 million will be used to bridge part of the affordability gap. That then leaves us a shortfall of £2.494 million. And in order to address that, we will need to reduce our ORPU values by 0.612%. Once we're taking that into consideration, we then have 19 schools that will receive minimum per pupil funding. That's an increase of 5, with an increase of additional £337,000, and 26 schools in receipt of minimum funding guarantee, a further 10, with an additional increase of about £50,000. We then have to look at the schools block transfer in terms of financing that through the ORPU deduction. And in order to do that, we need to reduce that by an additional 0.8265%. So therefore, overall, the ORPU values will reduce by 1.4385%. So once we take the schools block transfer into consideration, we will then have 22 schools in receipt of minimum per pupil funding, so an additional 3, at a cost of another £500,000, and 43 schools in receipt of MFG, so an additional 17, at a cost of another £120,000. So we will now have 13% of our schools on minimum funding guarantee. Last year that was 44%. In 25-26, our formula factor values only increased by 0.5%, whereas this year they've increased by 2.11%, which explains why we have a lot lower number of schools on MFG compared to last year. So in monetary terms, taking affordability in the schools block into consideration, the ORPU value in the primary sector will reduce by £58.46, Key Stage 3 by £81.79, and Key Stage 4 by £92.21. The reason for the higher downward adjustment to ORPU relates to the compulsory factor minimum per pupil funding levels, and application of the minimum funding guarantee. Any capping and scaling cannot take a school's per pupil funding below the minimum per pupil funding levels. So if we compare the cost of the minimum per pupil funding and the MFG from the starting point to the position after affordability in the school's block, then the cost of the minimum per pupil funding is about £875,000 and the MFG is about £173,000. Because although we are reducing the OPA by this 1.4385%, we are still within the 2.5% margin that we are allowed to do. So we are still considered to be mirroring the formula. So that's in terms of, there's a lot of numbers there that I've just kind of thrown at you. So they will all be provided through the update paper so that you can then digest all of those. But that's where we are at the moment in terms of the affordability position. If we then go back to the main report, in addition to the APT work, we are also in the process of finalising a number of budgets, including trajectory work and modelling and sector engagement. Under DfE regulations, there are a number of budgets that require schools form approval that we'll now go through. These are in tables 3 to 5 that start on page 23 of the report. So we take each of these tables separately. So table 3 relates to the schools block. Under the regulations, these budgets can be set at any monetary amount. So we have, first of all, funding for growth. Now, the report says 2.141 million, but that will now be reduced to 1.319 million. And that is a budget in order to fund both the explicit and the implicit growth. And we have schools reorganisation policies to ensure that schools are compliant, and funding will be allocated in accordance with those policies. Table 4 relates to, on page 24, relates to the Central School Services block ongoing commitments. And again, these budgets can be set at any amount. So we have the admissions budget, which is to do with the operation of the system of admissions of pupils to schools. And again, we've got 2 columns here. You've got the proposed budget for this year and the budget for last year. We have SACRA, which is expenditure in connection with local authorities' functions in relation to Standing Advisory Council on Religious Education. And then we have the local authority retained duties for all schools. And this relates to statutory responsibilities local authorities hold for all schools, and is detailed in the table. On page 26, we have Service in the Schools Forum, which is a budget we've had for many years now. We have the Centrally Employed Teachers Employee Contribution Budget, and that funds the increase in the employee contribution rate teachers' pension schemes that increased several years ago. And it also now incorporates the inclusion of separate grants for national insurance contribution and the school budget support grant. We also have the Education Welfare Services budget. This identifies children who are of school age but are not registered pupils at a school and are not receiving suitable education other than at the school. And finally, on page 27, we have Central School Services historic commitments. And this budget has to be set at a historical amount. It's not permitted to increase. And this is where we have the budget for the PFI, which funds the contractual commitment for the 7 PFI schools built over a decade ago. And this budget is to meet the 26-27 obligations to the PFI arrangement relating to the capital grant affordability for the special schools that we are required to maintain centrally. In terms of the financial outlook for the Council and Children's Services, the provisional 26-27 local government finance settlement confirms significant funding simplification, a new outcomes framework from spring 26, and improved funding position for the council due to high council tax assumptions and phased fair funding gains. Despite this, the council's net budget requirement is rising, and substantial savings of £62 million are planned alongside further work streams to manage ongoing cost pressures. The Council's Children's Services continues to perform strongly with outstanding children in care service and a strong focus on prevention. But the rising number of children subject to child protection plans are increasing pressures on school services, such as early help and children's social care. Growing demand and increasing complexity and reliance on high-cost independent placements poses significant financial risk, requiring a £13.961 million cost pressure to meet current and future children in care needs. In terms of our next steps, then final checks are being undertaken on our APT tool at the moment before submission on Thursday to the DfE. The school budget must be published by the 28th of February. So in conclusion, the council proposes to continue adopting the national funding formula for 26-27, but due to affordability pressures and the schools block transfer, we require a downward reduction of the ORP rates to 1.4385%. And as I said, this is within our permitted range. Also using the growth funding to address the affordability gap. The council requires the schools form approval of key budgets and will finalise 26-27 allocations by June while continuing work on securing DHG sustainability. The high needs block remains a significant concern, particularly ahead of the statutory override ending at the end of 27-28. The DfE expects the local authorities to minimise deficits and manage the system effectively. Thank you very much. Open to questions on all of the report, affordability, and obviously the three tables.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Last two things. So Forum is asked to know the contents of the report. I suggest that we've done that. But then we're also asked to agree the proposals. You set those out on the table, and that's a part of the report as well. So what I suggest we do is take questions going through the report. So we're in a position to put to a vote the proposals that Elizabeth has put before us. So if we just sort of move through the paper, I know there's a lot to go through there. Has anyone got any questions on pages 12 or 13 of the report?
Could I just ask a question? You presented a report which we're noting, but actually listening very carefully to what you've said, some of the tables there have actually changed. So you verbally updated them. So they're not actually in the report, and I don't have anything in writing as far as I know setting that out. Is that the situation?
Yeah, so that's like the same as it was last year because of the timings of when. So the only thing that's physically changed in terms of this actual main report is the budget for the growth in table 3. And then whereas at the moment this report talks about the proposals to address the affordability gap, we've now got some figures behind that. So at the last meeting, it was agreed following the consultation with the school forum that the affordability gap would be addressed through the ORP deduction. That's all we're doing. It's just obviously until now we haven't actually been able to provide an update what that means in monetary and figures terms. Whereas we now have some of that. So last year, because of when we had to have from the information provided by the DfE and the timescales we work to, we can only look at affordability sort of Friday and today, and we had to submit the whole thing by Thursday. So as we did last year, we provide a verbal update, and then you'll get another update that kind of then includes this information in it. But the principles that you all approved are still there. It's just that you might have some monetary values to add to it.
Sorry, just to add to that. So the decision the local authority takes will be on the actual formula itself, as the central budgets are the responsibility of the schools forum. So in terms of the options, in terms of we consulted with schools, we consulted with the forum in terms of how we would address affordability if it did come true, and fortunately it has. So these are the options that we've adopted to try and manage that as a sector. So those are the ones that Liz has sort of outlined, and there will be a supplementary paper to show you how that's been undertaken. That will be taken to the Children's and Culture Scrutiny Committee on Friday, this coming Friday, which is a pre-scrutiny decision essentially. And then subsequent that will go on to our executive councillor for formal decision making as part of a local authority process. But we felt it was helpful giving you early insight of what that position looks like in terms of that affordability and the steps that we were doing, and actually providing some quantification of what that would look like from a age-weighted pupil unit reduction, both from a affordability and a schools block transfer. But we try to manage it as best we can, particularly through reducing our schools growth fund and falling rolls factor. So we've reduced that down and to try and minimise the overall funding gap. And then essentially that they were our next options in terms of how we would address that gap.
Andrew, just come.
Well, I've listened carefully to the figures. Obviously that you verbally announced today. I've read the report and you varied them quite in certain places, like as you say, table 3 and table 4. So I was trying to keep a mental note of them without anything to refer to. So I think that's probably my point. I don't know how many people have sat here going, oh, I write all those things down, because we're noting a report that has actually physically changed at the time it's written. That's what.
So there's only one figure that has changed, and that's on table 3. There's been no changes to table 4. Table 3 changes a change from the budget. So the budget 2.1 million is what we've received as the local authority for schools growth and falling goals, and that's now being amended in light of the requirements, which is then obviously being recycled to fund the shortfall in the national formula.
So has just to pick up on that, the AllPew values on table 2, they're not correct though now, are they?
They're funding that we receive as a local authority. So that's the pupil unit funding and the secondary unit funding that we receive as a local authority through our school block allocation. So this is an aggregated national funding formula allocation that we receive as the DfE's mechanism to give funding to the local authority. We then use that funding, overall quantum, to then set our funding formula.
No, that's understood. I was just taking the point. We can discuss the factors within this, but if we're being asked to vote on budgets at the end of it, have we got all the information we need to make a decision formally?
Yes, because there's two components for this. So there's one aspect in terms of these budgets. So the original table that you just referred to there, that's about funding that's coming into the local authority for the schools block, which is essentially funding the national funding formula, of which obviously we're looking.
Yes, I know that, but actually some of the things we're doing are to adjust the AllPew values, aren't they, through the deficit shortfall?
Yes, so as part of there's two elements of it. There's funding that's coming into the local authority, which the DfE set our pupil unit rates, okay, of which then that is an aggregated sum, which is borne based on lagged funding, pupil characteristics, and updated pupil numbers. We then that is then subsequently used in terms of what we're seeing in the appendices, which is trying to replicate the national formula. So that is what the national formula is setting in, and that is essentially what we're aiming to achieve and to fund. But due to the lagged arrangements in terms of how local authorities are funded, October 24 data, pupil characteristics, what we have to fund is based on October 25. There is a difference where Lizzie was drawing out about the free school meals factors. Bear in mind, we've had an increase in some of those deprivation factors, which is then meaning there's a funding gap that's been created because of the lagged arrangements that's been done. And essentially then what we're doing, so you'll see on the appendices, which is the national funding formula rates, unfortunately for the AllPew, we can't achieve that rate because we can't set an unaffordable structure, of which they're the amendments that we're looking to make in terms of the percentage that Liz just referred to. But that's not a decision of the schools forum today. That's a local authority decision. We're setting out that what the decision of the schools forum is the tables
on the budget,
on the central budgets, which is nice to do.
That's just what that's great. Yeah, super. That's what I wanted to get to. Thank you, Mark. Okay, right then. So thank you for that opening question, Andrew. Have we? No, not at all. No, please do speak up. Otherwise, we are not going to this forum. So no apologies necessary. No, thank you. Other questions, please, from forum. Laura.
With regard to the high needs block, I know some of that will be up in the air a little bit once we all wait for the white paper to be released. But we've had a lot of conversation previously about the introduction of the new hubs in schools and how they will be financially guaranteed to avoid any deficit to the schools taking those on. Do you anticipate that the changes that you're making to high needs block will allow that to continue for the security of those schools in that position?
Yes, I mean, we've set out to the schools in terms of the funding agreements. That's what we've set out in terms of what the cost base of the units are. We've worked with a select number of schools. We've engaged with those schools in terms of what we would consider an effective financial regime and funding formula for those, and that will be something that we'll continue to honour and continue with. I think the DfE recognise that clearly with the position of what's been set out for next year in terms of cash flat, which was obviously really disappointing in light of increasing growth. this is ultimately going to mean that local authorities are going to increase their overspends by a higher amount. But ultimately, we've got commitments in place and we need to meet those commitments to fulfil the requirements and to ensure that there's effective education that goes on, particularly in those units. So yeah, we will be honouring them based on formulas that we've set. So there's no risk of change in that, and we will be continuing to review that on an annual basis in light of cost increases as well, to ensure it does meet the cost requirements and there's no financial disadvantage from schools having such a model. Clearly, it's something that we feel is the right thing from a cost-based perspective for the high need spending. So it's in our best interest to support those units financially.
Thank you.
So, other questions, Josh?
Thank you. I think Mark's broadly answered mine in response to Laura's question, but for those settings like special schools, academies, alternative provision, where 100% of the funding comes, well, the vast majority of the funding comes out of the high needs block. That feels like even more opacity than there has been previously, especially not in Lincolnshire specifically to national level. The cash flat feels like a worrying first, or at least in kind of recent memory. So there's just a real concern that alternative and special settings are going to be funded on a cash flat basis, which is in effect a real terms cut, which feels at odds with the national agenda around inclusion and upstream thinking. So I think I suspect the policy position is the same as for hubs resource provision, that we need this provision. But is there anything you could add specific to special and AP?
Yeah, exactly. The funding that we're receiving is not necessary in terms of the cash flat element, isn't going to be something that we then apply automatically to our funding formulas. That's not the case. So we'll be reflective in terms of what those funding increases are amongst the school sector in terms of specialist schools, to ensure that we deliver fair funding and a fair settlement for those to meet those requirements. So exactly like what you've heard there with the units, we will be considering those assumptions and applying those for 26-27, albeit it will be increasing the cost base on high needs. But fundamentally, we want to make sure that special schools and AP provisions are financially sustainable to meet those additional needs of children in those schools. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can just add for reassurance to the schools forum, really. Obviously, when the announcement was made the week before Christmas around the high needs block, representations were made to the DfE to understand how that policy position or policy statement fits in a larger landscape of just staying still is going to cost more because of it more expensive running costs, etc. And that doesn't even anticipate demand. And I guess what we hope for, and we saw one last week, didn't we, Workforce Development send announcement, is that I would anticipate over the next couple of months, before, during or after any white paper announcement, I would assume there will be other announcements to support that agenda, would be my recommendation or information to you today.
And also just to add, being on the national call, we challenged that, and essentially what came back was that the Treasury prioritised the transformation of SEND, and which was part of the June spending review 25. Circa was about 730 million of so they've prioritised the SEND reforms essentially over the base of funding of high need spending in local authorities. So essentially that's where they're prioritising, that's where they want to see the leverage and the change.
Or spinning every special and AP head teacher in the country, slightly less enjoyable Christmas. Sorry, that's I think it's not.
Okay, other questions? Martin.
Thank you. Apologies if I'm not quite understanding all the parts. I'm kind of understanding the bits about the funding going into the transformation side. I believe I understand that the local authority is getting higher levels of funding based on Table 2, notwithstanding some kind of alterations. But then we're going into the OPU, so the actual cash which is going into schools is decreasing. What we've got is a situation where schools are having to provide more support for more students, higher levels of support for more students, improve outcomes for students, and I suppose be at the core face of any transformational change, but by the way, do it with less money. And that would be, that's how I read that, and that would be my concern, is that if we're looking at something going forward, yes, we want to support everything doing, but actually, in order to even touch the transformational level or to even sustain levels of support that we've currently got, we're going to be cutting things out before we even start. So that would be my concern, if I'm reading it correctly.
Yeah, so the funding levels for all formula factors in the schools block are increasing. The OPU is increasing, but not as much as the national amount. So if we can afford a formula, taking the primary as an example, it'll go up by £4,064. Ours will go up by 4,006. So it still is going up a bit, but not as much because we can't afford that whole 2.11. But I recognise obviously that at the moment, whereas in the previous years, again, for additional grants for pay awards and those sorts of things, at the moment, there's no indication of those. So at the moment, schools will have to finance pay awards within the funding settlement. So it is, although there is funding going in there, we recognise there's still cost pressures that the schools are having to finance.
Back to that.
So that's
To answer your question.
kind of, but it doesn't take away the exceptionally challenging circumstances that schools would be about to go in. I mean, I get that, even if it's kind of it kind of gets wrapped up in some of those figures. The fact will still remain that the costing pressures outside schools' control are going to be even more burdensome than they are currently. In the midst of having to play our collective part in this transformational change.
Okay, thank you. So, Andrew.
Specific financial question, but based on your knowledge of schools, have you modelled some assumptions as to what those cost pressures will be in terms of staffing costs and some of their other specialists delivering? Have you modelled any of that?
So not in that respect, but what we have for our, certainly for our maintained schools, we have something called the monitoring intervention policy. So all the schools have to submit a 5-year plan. And obviously they factor in pupil number reduction, staff changes, those sorts of things. And then any school that triggers that policy for a variety of different reasons will then go on our radar effectively and get some level of monitoring intervention support. So for example, if you are in a deficit budget, so what we do is every month we will look at the schools, kind of look at the trajectory. They might undertake scenario planning that impact. We know that, as we said in the report, that there's a reduction in the growth rates, and that will probably continue at that level. So again, support is provided to the schools about scenario planning, about actually what schools need to do in terms of potential reduction in class sizes, for example, as those numbers, kind of the bigger ones go out and the little ones come in.
Martin. So, Martin, then I'll come to you, Mark.
So, good question, Martin. I think it's basically on the same. I think just on the transformation, I think there's, just to be really crisp on it, when we talk about transformation, there's local transformation in what we're doing in the current system that links into the schools block transfer, trying to play that through to positive impacts on what we're doing. The figure that we're talking around treasury and system transformation, 760 million, that's part of the white paper journey. That's a different transition transformation piece of work that's going on. In terms of understanding the drive, so I get the pressure of delivery for schools. I guess the other challenge within all of this is seeing how the system behaves. So we have done a lot of forecasting work at a postcode level around the impact of permanent exclusions, suspensions, EHCPs, demand for EHCP request. And when you do that piece of work, because all of those things mentally spend that high needs block, and I think there's some really important kind of analyses around that, around where the future demand is, where it's coming online from birth rates, patterns from health information, etc. But one of the most costly parts of the system is around permanent exclusions and meeting that 6th-day provision. And to give you an example, although we've got phenomenal partners who I think are busy and at capacity, is that is almost a bit of a whack-a-mole for permanent exclusions in terms of prediction. So we've got some success stories. I think I said it before at the last meeting. We've got the highest excluding school in Lincolnshire. Last year has gone from multiple permanent exclusions, and I believe I understand has only got one recorded this year. That's impactful. That's amazing. You know, that's 27 places where we're not having to find independent AP, which will cost millions for 27. The problem is it then pops up over here. So we can forecast and we can predict, but some parts of that high need system shift really quickly and come out of the blue. And so I just wanted to kind of map that through, because when we talk about declining growth, birth rates, at the same time, we're seeing significant increase in growth of the costly provision. So I would say the investment in local transformation is having a positive impact. It's predicted. What I would say is the forecast, unless we go even further, mainstream hubs, reduction in suspensions and PX, the financial impact of that is significant, whichever way round we approach it. And the cash flat nature of the high needs block allocation just exacerbates that. But I would hope that the national transformation and the funding that comes along with that would counteract the impact of that February, March time, should it be published. So, sorry, that was a few bits, but it's a complex area. And we talk in the context of meeting need and send, but one of the bigger parts of the system is permanent exclusions in the system as well. So we need to understand how to balance that through. Sorry, Mark.
So we have Mark Latchford first.
So can I
That's been there before you, sorry.
the falling rolls fund, you sort of talk about there being exceptional circumstances to request extra funding. How many schools are going to be facing this issue, and what would exceptional circumstances look like?
So to begin with, there's a something called a SCAP return, and that has to prove that the demand is there in the next couple of years, and it is just like a little blip. So when we look at the SCAP return, there was no schools that triggered it because of that information. There's only 29 local authorities nationally that have that as a formula within there. So we will say it's because of that data. That's our first point to look at. And we would then look at the business case in terms of what the demand of it is. But if you've got a continuation of a falling roll, that's not its purpose. It is purely for if there's a little blip, but we can see that there's a requirement still for that provision of places going forward.
What scale is that for the local authority for schools? How many schools are in a risky?
So obviously, obviously being a rural setting in Lincolnshire, we have actually, particularly in the sort of rural schools, we are seeing declining number of roll. But actually, as compared to the towns and cities, actually, they're particularly nearing housing estates are actually seeing growth. So it is a bit of a mixed picture. But when we've looked at our data, it's not actually showing those rural schools as seeing an upward curve. So actually, that would not meet the mandatory requirements that the DfE set of the falling roll factor, essentially.
So
that is absolutely has to be set, and then essentially we will then consider other criteria, because obviously we've got a finite sum of money. Is actually what would meet that requirement, and this is where the staffing reduction panel, which includes the likes of Geraldine, myself, and provision planning, will set out actually what do these schools, if they did meet that first criteria, what other factors do we think that they would need to achieve, and we'd need to assess that on that basis. But ultimately, it's we don't want to where, for example, a school is reducing, we need them to be proactive and act accordingly with that, and not rely on this falling fall is essentially where our benchmark is. But clearly, if they did meet the SCAP return criteria, there would be serious considerations about giving them additional monies, because we need those places in subsequent years, and we don't want to destabilise the school on a temporary period like that.
Mark,
Yes.
Then we'll go to Michelle.
Yeah, so there's just a couple of points really. I think on the DfE funding side, and in terms of the additional transformational monies, which is quite substantial, and the profile of that, the DfE have said that's unlikely to change, even though there was the delay. So there'll be quite significant funding coming in 26-27, subject to its publication. And they've also said that this is not necessarily all monies going to local authorities either. So to talk about your point about, I mean, the tightening fiscal policies, well, clearly money is likely to go to schools to facilitate change, and I think you would expect that to be the case as well. So that was something, again, just heard last week, that it's quite a significant sum of money not to be pushed back. It is the profile that's been set out in that June spending review, and monies will be going to local authorities and schools to facilitate that change. We'll have to wait and see what that looks like. So hopefully that gives you a bit of reassurance on that front. In terms of schools funding, yeah, I know we had this debate last time out, didn't we, in terms of this current year's funding, and the pay award only being part funded. So having to be funded through efficiencies, and I know the language used, it obviously was unhelpful, I think, from the DFE, because essentially you are doing that in any case to balance your budget. So I think there is that point, and that's something we've been making representation at a national level to say that actually it is tightening schools. I mean, you are putting a lot on schools, particularly in light of increasing costs in provision. But I think the government, from our perspective, the Treasury is setting the amount that we're having to work to. So essentially, we need to set the formula based on our schools block allocation, and essentially what Liz has articulated is that point. But we do recognise it is a much tightening financial position. The DFE, particularly about the part pay award, they considered schools still to have available reserves to meet those type of costs. And I think this is where we then need to see in updated returns. So in terms of when you've completed your financial accounts, what that financial flexibility looks like, but one would expect that to be falling in light of the government decisions in terms of the overall funding and cost increase in terms of delivery. So it would be interesting to see when DFE updated benchmarking comes out, to see where that position lies. I think that'll be something we'll be wanting to use when making representation to the DFE in terms of future funding settlements. But they've obviously set it out for the 3-year period, and as you'll have seen, it's not significant increases in funding across that period.
Michelle Anderson.
Thank you. Nothing I'm going to say is epiphanous, but I feel compelled to underline Martin's point here. And I think it's important to stress that hopefully, Mark, what it will give you is yet another element, I was going to say weapon, but another element of knocking on the DFE's door. I mean, I've sat on this forum now for 10 of my 12 years of headship, and I understand the complexities of all of the different budgets that you're manoeuvring things around, and DSG, and the stresses of alternative provision and meeting the needs of students in the classroom. I wish I could be transformational in the same way that the DFE are hoping that they're going to be transformational, but I can't do that. I was widely quoted, as Martin was, at a meeting last year about crying tears and losing sleep over my budget. This is the bleakest in all of my years of senior leadership, which is more than 25 now and 12 as ahead, the bleakest I have felt about my budget going forward. And Lizzie, with all due respect, the idea of a 3-year, 5-year budget for a head on the chalk face, where you're responsible for 2,000 children, 120 teachers, 100 support staff, to be respectful, it's probably got quite significant degrees of fiction in my projections. When the biggest thing that I have no control over is what the STRB is going to recommend and what the government is going to accept on a national pay award. And to know that I'm potentially going into, and I'm sure this is representative of everyone sitting in this room and probably every head in the country, but it needs to be minuted, and you need to keep banging on their door. To go into this round believing that that's not going to be financially supported in any way will bring schools and heads to their knees in a position that they are already at and beyond. It's not going to be just me thinking, I can't see a way, I cannot do this anymore. And that needs to be in the minutes, loud and clear. I'm not expecting the DFE to react to me putting this forward. I just felt compelled to underline Martin's point that we are in a position, in my experience, we have not been in before.
So
Thank you, Michelle. Tony.
I'd like to support Michelle with that view. The question that I wanted to ask Lizzie is, with your view of the whole sector, how many schools are you now directly working with to try and organise or sort out potential deficit budgets? Having one of my schools has just gone through a similar position where the head teacher has been in tears, has been struggling, has been trying to make sure they're getting the right people at the budget end to work through to actually get us into a position where this year we can, but in 12 months' time, and based upon the scenario planning that then you're going to ask them to do for that 3, 4, 5 year period of time, they're going to bring back to governing boards. The stress I can see that they're being put under for something, which I fully agree with Michelle, is from the day that it's written on the paper, 2 days later, it's completely changed. So we're having to make decisions and planning on inputs from the DFE that will change daily, that we cannot understand, we can't put figures to. We're making guesses. I've used the term used out in the industry of a wag. It's a wild ass guess because we're just picking figures from the air without any real basis to it. And that's the sort of planning tools that the teachers and our financial teams or financial committees are trying to work with to try and produce those plans and produce that scenario planning that we're being asked to do in the future.
Thank you, Tony. I think Tony asked a question about the number of schools being supported, Lizzie. Do you have an opportunity to come back?
Yeah, so obviously this relates to the maintained school academies. So we had approximately 20 that were in deficit at the end of last financial year. And so that those all get support. We had a number that set a deficit budget. And then we had a number that have set potentially deficit budgets for future years. And we kind of take a risk-based approach to that, get based on the size of the team and the resource that we have. So those that are in immediate deficit or deficit budgets will get more support. Some will get less to say, it looks like, 2 to 3 years time, if the projections continue, you may go to a deficit. These are things that you need to start to think about. I would say probably around about half the schools triggered it for one reason or another this year. Into say, but that is deficit from last year, deficit budgets, or it can be triggered by a significant reduction in number of enrolled, significant reduction in carried forwards, or going into deficits in future years. So it triggers it for a lot of different reasons. Saying the ones that are a bit more kind of further ahead, it's a case of, you need to start to think about scenario planning, because although we have a lot of schools that, and Michelle, are doing every single thing that they can do, we do see some schools that are not being as proactive, are not looking at the medium-term side of things, and therefore don't start to look at, say, classroom reductions until they've already hit the deficit, as opposed to actually kind of being a bit more proactive with it. So some of that scenario plan I know is very difficult in terms of, as you say, some of those things are unknown, but we have a very level of degree of the same in terms of what the schools that are being proactive in terms of financial position, and some of them that are not as proactive when, for example, they're looking at a member of staff being replaced, actually know right side what that actually may be. So there is a significant number of them that have triggered the policy in one way or another.
Yeah, just a point in terms of your sector, Tony, there's 19 primaries that are in a deficit, which represents that 14%. I think overall, I would say that school balances are reasonable.
Yeah.
But actually what we are seeing is a declining picture with that. So reducing flexibilities. And obviously with the forecast, we are seeing more falling into that sort of category where we need to try and support them. So what we are seeing, higher numbers of schools coming into our staff reduction panel in terms of having to make structural changes to ensure that they remain financially sustainable. So we are seeing more schools come in to those sessions. But this is the sort of analysis that we will continue to do and to make representation to the DFE on. And I think, Michelle, just go back to your point really, that I think the position this point last year, the DFE said that there was no funding for pay awards.
Oh, don't give me something to hang on to. Me too, but
But obviously they came out and obviously did provide a part contribution to that.
I do think they might again.
One hopes though. I mean, it's all about fair funding, isn't it? And they must recognise that. So within their sort of national assumptions, they will have an idea of potentially what the increase of the 2.11% increase in formula factors would fund. And it will be then subject to the pay committee and see if there's any differentials. But as I'm happy to sort of take forward those points and raise them directly to the department in terms of those financial uncertainties. But Tony, I know we do provide the financial assumptions. So we as a local authority, we provide schools an idea of potentially what to model. Albeit it can change, but hopefully it then provides a strong position a much stronger position in which the schools to respond to in terms of their financial planning.
Thank you both for that. But I just want to quickly go back onto, you mentioned you're working, but potentially 50% of schools within this particular sector are looking at. To me, that would be an immense worry bead somewhere along the line about there's an issue here, you know, how are we going to move forward? I'll be interested to hear what sort of risk mitigation you're potentially doing, because that workload is not only at the schools, but it's coming back at your level as well. And I do appreciate that.
It is, and essentially we need to target our resource to those most in need, but also the guidance and the new system of the MTFP that we've implemented is trying to create more capacity for that business partnering, that financial analysis and support, particularly on focusing more on maintained schools here, to rather move away from the transactional checking to actually much more of a focus on strategic planning. I think even more so than now, it is really important. This is not a local challenge. I know many local authorities have similar sort of issues. I think the falling roles one is a particular one, and this is not just for rural. Actually, it's in the city. London has been referring to some of those drops in number of role and financial sustainability of certain schools. So it is very much a national consideration, and I think this is where the national funding formula does need to be reflective. Bear in mind, it's a funded pupil-led orientated formula. And ultimately, we just need to make sure there's a formula in place. And this is the point about local flexibilities. We're keen to ensure there's local flexibilities, but obviously the national formula is driving for that more centralised model. But it's important that we as local authority representatives and schools share the views, what's happening locally, to ensure that influences the right outcomes in terms of any national formula. I still feel that's really important to do. So hearing the views is important as part of this sort of collaboration and sharing.
Thank you, Mark. Laura, you wanted to come?
Yeah, just to build on that really. So I don't have 12 years experience of headship yet, and I've got 5, and it's getting harder each year. And I think a lot of that kind of long-term planning can be quite difficult as a new head, because I didn't go into this to be a head and to look at budgets. That wasn't, the initial drive. And I think one of the things that I found coming in was then being thrust into that world where you do have to look at the long term and you do have to scenario plan, and you are going to go to a panel. And there was a huge part of me in that position that wanted to stick my head in the sand and go, I don't want to do any of those things. That's not very pleasant at all. Yeah. We're in a fortunate position where we buy back into the gold package, so we have some support through that. But I've recently been supporting a couple of other new heads who are in their first year of headship and in that exact same position, and are panicking about the reduction panel and what that will look like and how they do scenario planning. And that's not helped by that shift onto a different financial package, where you're looking at so many different spreadsheets and documents now that actually that's a really tricky thing to do. And there are many schools that can't afford the buyback because they're having to make those cuts wherever they can. So I think in terms of kind of the support that maintained heads and possibly academies could buy into is actually to have some training sessions where those head teachers can join online. What does effective scenario planning look like on that new system? How can we do that when we can't guarantee what those figures from the DFE are going to look like in 3 to 5 years? Really, we've only got the next 2 years sorted. If you have to go to a reduction panel, what do you have to prepare? I know we get an email with a form, but actually, what does that look like? What is that interrogation going to be? What questions do you need? How many different scenarios do you need to produce? Because actually, it's a really challenging time, and you're saying 50% of the schools are there. I would suggest that many of those head teachers are feeling those questions, and actually, if you can put that preemptive training to support people, they're likely to have a better grasp and not leave it till the deficit budget before actually seeking that support, but have a better handle long term of their finances and make those decisions earlier on.
Thank you. So we are trying to expand our training program for all varieties, including new head teachers. So we have now reintroduced, again, this is for the maintained schools, so appreciate this is the same for academies, but they are welcome to attend these sessions. So we now have 2 half days for new head teachers, a full day for new business managers. I recognise it's probably only kind of very whistle stop tour, but it gives you the starting point of what to do with that. We're also doing the new induction training sessions that the education team will run for new head teachers. We have about over 85–90% of our schools on what we call our silver and gold. So the majority of schools can access that additional support. There is also our help desk facility. So there are elements there, but I recognise as a new head teacher, while trying to do everything else, the finances is a complex area to go through. And I think it's particularly difficult for new head teachers who start that in September, because obviously the budget goes in the financial year. So you're inheriting the budget as opposed to option then the next year when you set the budget yourself and you have a bit more feel for the areas that you want to go to. And again, obviously the first year of the new software, it's always a bit of a difficult transition from one to the other, but we hope now that as everybody becomes more familiar with it, it will really create savings at the budget setting process that we start to go through in February and March, because of how everything can just be rolled forward as opposed to starting everything from scratch. And again, what it allows us to do is, so for example, when we find out about things like funding updates, we can effectively apply, I'm going to call it a patch, which is, so rather than schools having to do sort of clunky workarounds, we can just put that in for all the schools straight away. And although it's a 5-year plan, we tend to focus on the sort of the first 3 years, because years 4 and 5 are so far ahead in terms of funding prediction, pupil numbers, that sort of thing. So it really is the short, sort of the medium term as opposed to the longer term that we have to go on to kind of focus on that side of things. We look at 5 and 4 and 5, but 1, 2 and 3 are the bits that we really focus on, because say things can change so much in that longer period.
Thank you, Lizzie. Martin Mikio, go ahead.
I suppose I just wanted to pick up on a couple of bits that were said, and I think there's also an understanding with how schools can kind of tip into that budget kind of unknowingly a little bit. For example, our curriculum lead is right now building our timetable for next year, and kind of going through all that process, options process. We're preparing for sixth form. We're doing all the bits and pieces to prepare. And I suppose if I had a magic wand, and assuming that there isn't any extra money, my genuine wish would be on timing. So if I knew now as head teacher for school that actually salaries are going to go up by this percentage, and even if it was the most horrible news, we're talking about maybe getting a little bit more of hope, but I say salaries are going to go up 3%. You know what? And we're only going to get 0.5% of that, and you've got to do efficiency savings for the rest of it. I can plan, because actually over the next 6 months, I would, because I'm going to go into recruitment, I'm going to be accepting people's resignations, people are going to retire, and I can plan for that going into September next year. One of the biggest frustrations that gives me the biggest headache over the summer is having a curriculum which looks wonderful and beautiful. I've got everybody in place, and actually great coming in September, and all of a sudden, a random day in July, we are told, or it's confirmed that everybody's salaries are going to go up. And then there's a random day, maybe sometime in August or maybe September, to say, oh, and by the way, that 3% increase is going to be done. The year's already underway. So you're always paying on the back foot. So I can completely understand where teachers or teachers say that actually we're working on the deficit budget without actually knowing it, because actually right up until the final hour, we're working on an understanding. We're not being told. I think there was one year, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, the very last day of term, I think it was something like the 18th or 19th of July, we were told there was a 3% increase. I was thinking, well, that's our summer. What are we going to do? And obviously we found it, but actually there was no need for that. So if schools knew now, I would know who to appoint. I knew what grade we can appoint them at. We could plan for that, even if it was worst case scenarios. So for me, the magic wand would be not about necessarily more money. It's all timing for me.
And I think it's a point very well made. I'd echo that. I think that actually in the vagaries of funding and the difficulties of funding, which is why we've spent so long talking about this point already, there are some things which are set, and teacher resignation periods, our budget setting process, we know when those things are. And in Laura's example about new heads, I was just reflecting that those governing bodies know they're making the change. You know which schools they are, and they're your maintained schools. Ideal opportunity to get in there with a new head and run that through from Easter, because actually from Easter, you'll have had that person's resignation rather than worrying about it in the autumn term, whereas it's far too late. So I think anything we can do around that would be really helpful. Michelle.
Yeah, final point, I promise, from me. I think Martin's right again, you know, in actual fact, Martin, if it makes you feel better, the notes I'm making today are on my plans for what I'm forecasting, predicting my staff might be doing. And Mark, I think, and Martin, you too, when you're having your conversations with the DfE, and I know this is pie in the sky, another date that doesn't work is the teacher resignation deadline now. That is so antiquated. May 31st is just ridiculous. I need to know now, for the very reasons that Martin has explained there, what staff are planning to do, let alone without the recruitment crisis that we've got, particularly in this county.
Mm-hmm.
It's just too antiquated, it's too late. It messes up all the financial planning and leaves me making decisions, as Martin has explained, just as late in the day, if not come September.
Sure. I don't think it particularly needs an answer, probably as noting, and I think you're hearing the frustrations of the sector about the implementation of finances.
I mean, I'll just say to recognise all of those and we do understand the challenges that you face. We really do, and so we'll continue to make those representations, and we'll be specific on some of those that you've gone out today.
Now, we can't leave this agenda item yet because you want some decisions from Forum, don't you, on these budget headings? You'll be delighted to know I've got some questions about these as well. I don't know whether you want to take them line by line? Do you want to take them in block? Do you want to just hear our questions first to satisfy ourselves and then we put them to a vote? What's the best thing, Lizzie, as far as you're concerned? Because obviously you want to take this away
I mean,
on this meeting.
fundamentally, obviously, we need to go table by table. So whether it's better to go any questions on table 3 and then table 4 and then table 5 as they relate to different blocks.
So we're on page 23, then. Sorry, yes.
I did raise the first question.
Yes.
You had said, note the contents of the report. Contents of the report in certain tables have changed. So can we just minute?
Yes.
Actually, note the contents of the report as verbally updated.
That's well said. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, so table 3. Granting changes. Will you just let us know if there are changes to any of these numbers so we can make sure we know what we're voting on?
Table 3 is the table where the budget figure has changed for 26-27. So on the report, it says the gross budget is 2.141 million.
Yeah.
It is now going to be 1.319.
1.319. 319.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's to fund then our growth requirements for the financial year.
So there's a decrease of what you were intending originally.
Just clarify.
Or are you saying it's going to be an extra 1 point?
So the 2.1 million is what we've received from the department.
Yes.
As of the formulaic arrangement that's been provided to support local authorities meet growth fund and fall enroll requirements. So that's the 2.1 million that's been quoted there. Yeah, this is in the schools block, and we've got the ability to move this monies if for example, our requirements are lower. So we've gone through our school reorganisations in light of looked at the requirements, future requirements, and based them on our policy, which we've set it at 1.4 million now.
So you are saying originally the authority was given 2.141 million, and actually you've looked at what would be required to fulfil those obligations, reduced it to 1.319 million, because you've then moved that money elsewhere to support
the national funding for
affordability.
So it's still within the schools block. It's just that it's moved from the school growth falling role into schools budgets. So we're moving that money into school budgets.
Thank you for that clarification. Is everyone clear on that there? Yes. Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful. Right, so we're now looking at 1.319 million from 0.983. Okay. So that's really helpful. I've actually just got one lingering question on this then, and it actually ties in with the question that Mark Ratchford had, which was about the falling roll factor funding. We considered the exceptional request. It's a little bit vague at how much is put into that pot, and from what I understood in the discussions you're having, not all local authorities have got that. So how much is there within that? And
So within that £1.319 million, it's
Yeah.
£85,000 for falling roll. The rest of it is for the growth side. So that the 2.141 million was the budget we received for both the growth and the falling rolls. And that's in terms of what we're receiving. And then what we're saying is that in entirety between the falling rolls of 85,000 and the growth, what we need is 1.319.
You didn't feel you need.
so how much is in the falling roll factor then?
That's 85,000.
That's 85,000.
But you said you didn't have anyone on your scatter test.
So it's based on one school at the moment. It's a historic one, but there's no new schools that are likely to trigger it based on our data.
That's 85,000 for one school.
And that's going to end in 26-27.
Okay, any other questions on table 3? Okay, I think we need a decision then. So the proposal is that Forum approves the budget factors on table 3. Can we see show of hands for those in favour? Thank you. Got those. And anyone against? No hands. Any abstentions? Okay, right, thank you. So table 4 then. Again, if you could just go through the changes there to the numbers, please.
Yes, there are no changes to any of the figures in table 4. They are exactly as the information that's been presented in the report.
Okay, are there any questions around table 4? My question, I think I might know the answer, is the centrally employed teacher employer pension contributions. That budget has gone up by 33% approximately, and yet the pension increase obviously less than that. Is that to make up for those factors that the government aren't rolling into schools' budgets?
So essentially,
is that an increase in staff?
So this is so the department have used this as a route not only to fund local authorities, centrally held teachers within the DSG, high needs, early years, but also other services such as the music service. So essentially, this is funding that they're allocating to us. So we've had an increase in funding by this amount. And essentially, we're then using that money to then offset the actual costs. So this is not impacting schools at all. It's a grant that they've added into our central school services block, of which we've then got to distribute it to those areas, service areas. One is the music service, which is actually outside of the DSG, but essentially it's there to support increasing cost base amongst certain services for those that have got centrally employed teachers.
Okay. Any other questions?
It's unhelpful in a way that it comes.
No, it isn't. No,
Through a separate
it's really again having clarity on, is that money going to impact on schools?
No.
And Martin was saying it's exactly what schools are doing in terms of we're not looking at increasing our teaching costs by 33%. So it was just really having some clarity.
So just like schools, you received a separate grant in the current year, and it's now being mainstreamed into the national formula. Essentially, we received a separate grant for centrally employed teachers, and then this is their way of mainstreaming the funding to the local authorities to meet those costs.
Thanks. Okay. Any other questions?
Comments?
Yes, please.
Can I just check on the home education side of it? I mean, I have experienced a number of parents removing their children from mainstream schooling because of behavioural issues and that sort of thing. how is Lincolnshire addressing that? Are you following those up to make sure that those children are getting education? Is this a vital part of that cost?
So it is, the nuance, are you referring to electively home educated children?
The last point is
Yeah.
available.
So that is under, shall we say, pressure because of the increase in the number of young people, and bearing in mind electing to home educate is a right and it's a valid way for some families, etc. We are seeing more in that key stage 4 space where young people are beginning to go electively home educated because mainly due to dissatisfaction with the school. In terms of policing and checking, I think that's a broader debate, Andrew, around do we talk to schools where we think there are patterns and trends that look incorrect? Yes, we do. Do we have the ability to police and enforce it? No, but we do make referrals either to the governing body, chief executive of the MAT, to say there's something not quite right. And I think schools, particularly in the secondary sector, we've got a few secondary colleagues here today, I think they work quite tightly together as well, where they have different families moving between schools. And if anything seems untoward, I think they do kind of follow it up between them. But overall, the numbers for EHE are increasing year on year. And that does have a demand placed upon us to do those suitability checks and whatnot.
Okay. Any other questions on table 4? Okay, so it's been proposed that Forum approve the budget headings within table 4. Can I see a show of hands, those that approve? See. Thank you very much. And anyone objecting? The exceptions. Thank you very much. That's carried. Okay. Same for table 5, please. The figures in table 5.
The same.
Stay the same. Thank you very much. Any questions on table 5? Well, Pierre,
I think it's,
Andy.
yeah, I think it's more of a heresy than a question. I just wanted to check because it says about a decade. The PFI school Ireland's been open 23 years. So I just wanted to check it wasn't a second group of PFI contracts.
No, the contract is say early 2000s.
Yeah.
They were built and it's 2032 when it will officially end as a PFI arrangement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's that same one group. It's not a second one.
The 7 schools of which Yard Trust there's 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, can I see those in favour of approving the budget in table 5? Hands, please. Thank you. And anyone against? Abstentions on that one? No, that's carried then. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, I think, Lizzie, that's all of your report and budgets to approve, yes? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for, I think that reflects certainly the sector's actions financially. So thank you. You answered those questions. If we can move on to agenda item 6, the early years national funding formula. It just arrived on Friday, so Geraldine.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry for the paper being a follow-up to the original circulation. So this report provides a summary of the early years national funding formula, and we wish to seek school forum's approval on the centrally retained elements of the budget. The early years funding rates are the rates that the department pays to each local authority to fund the early years entitlements. And that includes an hourly rate for children aged 9 months up to 2 years, a rate for both the 2-year-old entitlements, which is the same for families receiving additional support and those that are eligible for the working parent entitlements, and a rate for the 3 and 4-year-olds for both the universal and extended hours. We received details of this funding on the 15th of December, which has obviously meant significant work across the last month to determine local budgets. In addition to the 3 distinct hourly rates that we receive, we also have additional funding in early years for the maintained nursery schools, the Disability Access Fund and Early Years Pupil Premium. The government has suggested that they intend to consult on the early years national funding formula, and they'll do that in the summer of 2026. A couple of changes have been made to the DfE guidance. These don't propose major challenges for Lincolnshire, because we already pass through 97% of our early years budgets to providers. Publishing our rates to the sector well ahead of the 28th of February deadline, which we did last year, and delivering our special educational needs inclusion fund in the way that the DfE has prescribed. So no huge changes there for us. There are two key adjustments. The government has rolled the teachers' pay and pension grants into the funding formula in early years. And in Lincolnshire, we recognise the additional costs that are faced by schools in relation to teacher salaries and pension contributions. So we do intend to continue to identify funding within the local formula as a quality supplement to be distributed to maintain schools and to support those cost pressures. The move to a termly funding system should prove to give more accurate budgets to local authorities. So we see that as a positive change. The formulaic approach to the funding has been explained alongside the hourly rates for each of the age groups and the total funding that we anticipate to receive in Lincolnshire in 2026-27. Lincolnshire is still funded on the minimum funding rate, so the area cost adjustment has a significant impact on the hourly rate for local authorities, and Lincolnshire, we are classified as low on that scale. As Lizzie's mentioned in her paper, the government expects to spend over 9.5 billion on early years entitlements in 26-27, which is over £1 billion more in early years entitlements next year compared to currently. And that's in recognition, obviously, of the rollout of the reforms. Lincolnshire's budget is predicted to be 115.850 million in 26-27 from the six funding streams previously mentioned. Please just do note an inaccuracy on page 3 with regard to the 3 and 4 year old total funding. Total funding we anticipate is 44.350 million, which is the DfE indicative allocation using the £6.20 base rate. The 45,985 I've mentioned prior to that was our local estimate, and that's been updated in the report. The government are asking local authorities to use our own local data alongside the budgets that they've predicted to ensure we reach an accurate estimate of potential income. And so we've been working hard at looking at last year's data alongside the information that they have published. They've also published 2 additional tools this year, which has been useful for local authorities. One is for determining the pass-through rate to providers, and another one is for local authorities to allow us to look at our local termly headcount data and compare what that might look like on our own information compared with the original published rates that we've received. And these tools are being used to ensure we get to a final position that maximises the rates that we give out to providers, whilst also applying some prudency in our approach. You'll note that the DfE has applied an adjustment to the 3 and 4 year old rates, and that is to support the transition to the new termly funding approach. And that should compensate local authorities for the anticipated budget reduction that we would otherwise see. So the move to a termly funding model for 3 and 4 year olds will result in a lower number of funded hours being reported across the year. And without that adjustment, it will result in lower budget allocations. So we still have to fund the same number of hours locally. And to support that transitional arrangement, a temporary upward adjustment to the 3 and 4 year old rate has been applied. That, however, will not be an ongoing adjustment, and we anticipate that's just for the next financial year. So without the 3 and 4 year old adjustment, the rate increase for the 3 and 4 year olds is proposed is at 5.3% for the 3 and 4 year olds. It's 3.8% for 2 year olds and 3.7% for the 9-month-olds. And I've given you the detail of the hourly rates and potential income for each budget stream there in the report. The other key requirements are detailed within the report, including, as is previously, a need for a mandatory deprivation factor for the 3 and 4 year olds. And then we have some discretionary around deprivation factors for the other entitlements. Within the guidance, the DfE has suggested they expect local authorities to pass on an uplift to the provider rate, which is broadly in line with the increases that we expect to see. and that uplift should be achievable within Lincolnshire. The final base rate calculations will be confirmed to providers by the deadline in February that we now have. We do hope to complete the tasks associated with the actual rates to providers in the next couple of weeks and send something out by the end of this month if we can, which is what we did last year. And we hope to do that to allow our childcare sector enough time to plan their own budgets so that they are comfortable, ready for April onwards. We are using the DfE step-by-step calculations and our own local data related to the 2025 part-time equivalent places that we've seen in Lincolnshire and our take-up levels to agree the budgets for the sector. And we hope that this will give greater accuracy regarding our expenditure. We propose to use the same deprivation factors that are currently in place, so no major changes to that, both for the 3 and 4-year-old entitlement and an uplift for the 2-year-old entitlement for the children that are receiving that through the families receiving additional support criteria. We did consult with providers in the autumn term, and I've provided you with some information on that within the report. We wanted to gain an understanding of what their costs were related to delivering the entitlements. And we also include some questions around the Special Educational Needs Inclusion Fund. The conclusion from that was that providers wanted to maintain the current levels of funding regarding SENIF and increase the base rate where possible. So we'll keep that under review. On Friday, just as of last week, we received an update from the government, obviously on the additional 200 million SEND training offer that we're expecting. And we are expecting some additional announcements from the government on further grant funding to support SEND. And I have been involved in some DfE briefings before the Christmas break, which included some considerations for that. We expect those announcements to follow the school's white paper, setting out the government's full plans to reform, obviously, the SEND system. So we'll await further information on that. The M&S supplementary funding will be aggregated. Again, they've just given us an uplift to the M&S supplementary hourly rate, but we have to consider that across all of the hours that our maintained nursery schools deliver. So we've used 2025 data to look at the 5 maintained nursery schools in Lincolnshire and the hours that were delivered. Say 78% of hours were related to the universal offer and 22% to extended. And so that will be applied when aggregating the hourly rate across to increase the M&S supplement, and the rate for those schools will be published shortly. The national funding rate for Disability Access Fund will increase to £970 per eligible child per year in 26-27, and that's a 3.94% increase on the current rates. The national funding rate for early years pupil premium will increase to £1.15 per eligible child per hour next year, and that's a 15% increase from the current year. And we'll fund based on the universal hours, so up to 570 hours a year, so £655 per child. The government requires Schools Forum to agree the central spend for early years, and a summary of the central support services has been provided for you within the report. Same as previously, there are 3 functions within the service that support the sector. They've been outlined as sufficiency, sustainability, and activities related to the early years entitlement funding. The second being quality improvement and workforce development, and the third being inclusion and the SEND local offer. Proposed funding to be centrally retained for all those services is 3.367 for 26-27. That's 2.99% of the overall planned funding. And that's in relation to 112.6 million, which is the total budget from the 3 entitlement groups, which are considered within the pass-through rate. And so that's within the tolerance levels and within the threshold. So we're proposing in Lincolnshire to ensure that at least 97% of the overall early years funding is passed on to providers directly. And in conclusion, I've just highlighted some of the impact that the increase to the entitlements is having on families. In particular, we've had many are already reporting a huge difference in terms of the impact it's having on the family, making it more affordable for them to be able to access childcare for their children in early years, and also enabling them to work and train, which is really positive. We're aware that many providers currently find the levels of funding sufficient to support them to deliver high quality provision, with some reporting some cost pressures, and we continue to give them as much support as we can based on their needs. We're confident that the funding formula used meets the requirements within the national guidance. The Early Years and Childcare Support Team will continue to offer support, advice and guidance as is detailed within the report, ensuring that we have as much childcare that's accessible and flexible and inclusive provision to meet children's and families' needs. A consultation, as I say, was conducted with providers in autumn to gather data, and I've explained there the feedback that we had from the sector. There was a limited engagement, more limited than what we wanted, and it did reveal some significant variation in reported costs. So we're going to do some more work. Steps are being considered to support the sector in Lincolnshire, offering additional financial training and bespoke advice. We also participated in a review of the local management of special educational need inclusion funding with the government ahead of Christmas, and a link's been provided for you on Lincolnshire's case study within the report. So in summary, the principles of the local funding formula for each of the entitlements remains unchanged, and we do want to make sure that we maximise the provider rates. So getting that right in the next couple of weeks will be absolutely crucial for us, and that information will be published shortly. Thank you.
Thanks,
Please
Geraldine.
take questions.
Any questions or comments on Geraldine's report? Josh.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much. Will the establishment of any additional two-year-old provision create any pressure, either financially or otherwise, for us?
In terms of development of places,
Capacity in places.
Yes, so the nursery, school-based nurseries round that concluded just before Christmas.
Yeah.
I'm aware some Lincolnshire providers have expressed an interest in that. Will that create any pressure for the authority or for us as a sector, affordability-wise, or?
it shouldn't affect the budgets, because the budgets thankfully are now going to be based on termly head counts. So the more children in, they'll be included in those termly census counts, and that will go back to the government. So that will support the budget. So that's great. We do know that there is a need for some school-based nursery, and we are happy that in Lincolnshire we've submitted several applications so far on that. But in terms of that, that's generally supporting our sufficiency duty, making sure those places available shouldn't impact on the overall budget now that we're moving to a termly census collection.
Thank you for explaining.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments from forum?
Well, just ask the comparison of the numbers on the figures on page 8 and 9. How do they compare to previous years? Are they the same? Have they changed? They're just in proportion?
On the centrally retained budgets.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a slight increase of £400,000, I think, in terms of an increase, and that's related specifically to pay awards and additional support within the sector. And in addition to that, there's going to be an enhanced audit function. Obviously, with the increase in the investment in early years, the government is minded to make sure that we are doing everything we can to audit providers that are delivering early years entitlements. That includes making sure that all of the registers and attendance is accurate. So there'll be an increased audit function within the local authority to support that government intention as well. So it's to support some additional cost pressures there, and general pay awards within the service.
And the numbers of pupils change. Have you experienced the dip in birth rates? Is that affecting the early years now, or is that just in primary schools?
There has been a drop. The main change that we've seen within the take-up tends to be with regard to the families in receipt of additional support for the two-year-old entitlement. So there's a significant reduction in the number of families that are eligible for that two-year-old entitlement. But actually what we're finding is they are now families that are in the working criteria, which is positive because that's the government intention for families to be returning to training or work. And so the numbers are reflective in the working parent entitlements. There has been a slight reduction in terms of the overall number of 3 and 4 year olds with regard to birth rates, but nothing significant in terms of changes there.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add in terms of that, it's sort of counteracted by the actual rollout of the entitlement. So with obviously the government change in terms of working families and from 9 months old, that sort of counteracted potentially that what you're referring to. So actually, yeah, and obviously sufficiency is a key factor that we're monitoring, linked in with these sort of additional nursery provisions, But also, so we've had capital monies available to try and support that as well. But clearly that's something we'll need to keep under.
We've had a really positive take up in terms of the working parent entitlements, and actually in Lincolnshire, we're above, thankfully, regional and national levels in terms of those families that are eligible, accessing codes and then accessing their early years entitlements, and particularly even for children from the term after they reach 9 months. We have over five, I don't know the exact figure off the top of my head, but over 5,000 children in Lincolnshire in that entitlement alone, which is obviously adding to the increase in terms of the early years funding we're receiving. So it's a positive number of families that are accessing those new working parent entitlements.
Thank you. I'm concerned about the comment on page 12 about the lack of financial tracking in some settings. When you sat through our lengthy discussion about schools funding, and the percentage values of increases for early years are far in excess of the budget headings that we're looking at for schools funding. My concern would be that whilst the government wants this to happen, it wants to increase the places, it's putting money into the sector, but there are clearly inefficiencies in terms of how that funding is being, it could be used more effectively. I suppose that's what I'm concerned about, is actually the effectiveness of that. And whilst it might be a good thing to do in the short term to kind of pump prime, getting these places in, it's not going to last forever. And if your rates then decrease to go in line with schools funding, we could see a lot of those places being unsustainable. So it was just about the work of your team in sorting that out, because I don't think that schools would be allowed to continue with significant amounts of government funding if schools didn't have effective financial tracking.
And just to mention on that point, we have a lot of early years providers that are very, very good with their finances.
No. It must have been significant in the consultation for you to put it in there.
Yes.
I think it really stood out.
Yeah, what we recognise, I think, in early years is there's a real difference in governance models within the childcare sector. So we have childminders, we obviously have voluntary managed preschools that might be operating out of Village Hall. We have large private nurseries that have their own mortgages, that have business rates associated. So the costs are really, really variable across early years because it is a commissioned arrangement across private, voluntary and independent sector. And so I think it's what we want to do is hone into what are the costs for the individual governance models. So what does it look like for childminders? How is that different for a school delivering? How is it different to a private nursery? And we already offer a lot of business management and financial advice and support, but we want to increase that. And we also want to do that through the audit work. So again, we'll really be ramping that up to try and support the sector with understanding what their costs are and what the delivery model looks like. And making sure that the sector do remain sustainable, because that is our key aim. So, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for the report, Geraldine. Just a question referring back to Josh's question before around school-based nurseries. Are there plans, or is the capacity for, or is the need, should I say, for more of those going forward? So,
yeah, we've got pockets in Lincolnshire, and that's actually presented through the sufficiency report. We do that on an annual basis. We're just due at the end of this term to do another annual childcare sufficiency assessment to determine the number of places that are available, what's being accessed and where there are any shortfalls. And we know that there are some areas in Lincolnshire that we do have a shortfall. And so we've been working directly with schools in those areas to say, do you have capacity to look at school-based nurseries programme? And that's what we've done in phase 1. Thankfully, we did get some successful applications awarded. Through phase 2, we've just submitted those in December. So we're just waiting to see if we get any of those awarded. And we're hopeful all of the ones that went through, we supported. And then there's a planned phase 3 for school-based nurseries programmes again. So any that didn't get through phase 2, if they are in an area of need in Lincolnshire, we'll certainly be supporting them to be included within our plans for phase 3 as well.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Thank you very much, Geraldine. So we've got a proposal to agree the allocation and distribution of centrally retained budgets. I see those in favour. that proposal? I think that's unanimous. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Geraldine. Thank you. If we can move on, I'm aware of time. This meeting was scheduled to go to 3 o'clock. Take a pause at that time to see if we're able to carry on. We go to number 7, de-delegation of maintained school budget. I think, Mark, you're going to lead on this. We've had the report in advance. You don't need to read the report. If you just bring out of it any key aspects before them, and then dive straight into questions and get to the vote on agreement of those items. Okay, thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much. So this particular report focuses on maintained schools only, so not applicable for academies, and obviously there is voting requirements from the sector. So just by way of just an introduction, private reforms resulted in local authorities having to delegate funding out to schools, but we're permitted to de-delegate, recover monies to fund certain services, and that's obviously allowable in the national funding formula. Reflecting on the position in 24-25, you'll see on page 24 the services that it supports. So under the contingency line, it supports those schools in financial difficulty that we referred to in terms of the staff reduction panel, and also school intervention, school improvement services, and the ethnic minority and travel education team.
Sorry, Mark, page 34. Sorry,
sorry, page 34. Sorry, apologies. The spend at March 24 was 1.266 million. And you'll see on page 34 the activity that took place during that financial year. So a modest underspend of 71,000 relating to those activities. And then there was also some planned drawdowns as per prior decisions made by the forum. In terms of the actual commitment to that underspend, firstly, the first one relates to locality education lead support. So this is enhanced support that the forum have previously agreed to, and the local authority hasn't needed to draw down that reserve, having to net funding from core budgets. However, 255,000 is earmarked for that, for those additional activities of frontline locality team support over the next 2 years. Further agreements were made by the forum relating to an agreement over a 4-year period relating to the assessment for learning projects, which is on page 35, and it sets out some context, and any questions can be directed at Geraldine at the end in terms of that activity. That commenced in at the end last financial year, and it was there to try and drive performance within the maintained sector, particularly around assessment performance and secure and effective intervention. There was also a prior agreement relating to temporary support relating to the audit services for primary schools as well, which again touches on later in this report. So the remaining de-delegation reserve balance is 352,000, and I say at the bottom of page 35 details some of those variables relating to these budgets. So pupil numbers, movement of academies, maintained schools to academies, and also the in-year performance relating to those services. Page 36 sets out the de-delegations that are here in the current year, and the amounts that were deducted on a per pupil value, and also the baseline budgets that have been set out. Overall current performance is shown broadly on target. However, what is to be noted, and has been previously referred to, is that we are seeing more schools coming into the staff and reduction panel for review to set sustainable budgets, and there will be an increase in requirement of that going forward, of which there's a policy in place whereby we provide financial contribution to support a school to facilitate that change, subject to the school falling into financial difficulties. So then moving on to page 37, and these are the proposals for 26-27. We are intending to, or subject to decision today, to set the contingency rate. So for those services that are referred to relating to financial support through the staff and reduction panel, locality lead support, at the same rate as what we've applied at £29.23 per pupil. And that is still in light of the reduction in the maintained school numbers. We feel that we can maintain that within the current baseline, whilst also having a contribution from the available reserves of 352,000. Also, we would like to earmark 150,000 from that reserve for that specific point of schools in financial difficulties, as we're seeing a higher number coming through this route. And it's making sure that we put the schools first in that regard. We'll then also the remaining sum of 174,000 will be there to meet those variables as I referred to on the prior page, of which there are many. This will obviously be a position that we'll need to reflect on in 12 months' time, because it is temporary money, reserved monies, and we may need to increase that. But again, this was something that we'll look at that annual process. There is also the remaining budget of the Ethnic Minority and Travel Education team that supports the needs of such pupils in maintained primary schools, and that value being set at 210,000, which is the same level as set out in the current financial year. So then moving on to page 38, that sets out the requirements in terms of the per pupil sums that will be proposed to deduct from maintained primary school budgets, and the budgets that will be that it will recover from to meet those services. So that will be the first decision that we'll be seeking from maintained members. The second part relates to services for maintained school duties, and these are the duties that are held by the local authority relating to maintained schools only. And again, just briefly, some context on this is that, again, we devolved monies out previously to schools, and then also we used to then receive an education services grant, but that then since ended, and then local authorities had a decision to recover monies from the maintained schools. We've chosen not to do that, but actually we chose that in this current year, which was then subject to a decision that was made, that we would actually start recovering some monies to meet the costs of three-year cycle of school audits. So that's set out on page 38. So the internal role is there to provide the independent objective opinion, and it assesses the effectiveness of that governance and risk management, human resources and finance. And so that has been taking part in this current year, and Abby is here today to field any questions relating to that. Page 39 sets out the coverage of the breadth of what it contains. And in the appendices, it details in terms of how current performances, in terms of number of schools audited, and also key themes that are coming from that. In terms of the budget requirement for next financial year is 177,000, and that's compared to the 170,000 in the current year, which is just reflective of general pay increases. The rate will be a rate of £6.18 per pupil to ensure that the monies are recovered to meet that cost. And this is a cost that's covered across all maintained schools. So this is covering across the nursery schools, primary, secondary, and special. So it's coverage across all, as opposed to the delegations is purely primary. And then in the proposals for 27-28, again, this is in principle. It's to enable our financial planning, but in principle to support the continuation of these services beyond the next financial year, just to help with local authority financial planning. I'll conclude on there based on timing restraints, but we're seeking a decision from maintained primary school members relating to the delegations, which is focused on the primary sector, and then the services for maintained schools, which relates to audit services, is for the entire maintained sector.
Super, thanks, Mark. Thank you. Okay, any questions then from let's go primary first, primary maintained. So have you got any questions?
I just wonder if there's scope in the future to review the MTech team, because I know every school context is very different, and there will be some schools that really benefit from that team, but some schools who are paying and not benefiting at all. So is there any way that could be reviewed so that schools where they might have a higher level of children who would need that service could actually pay a smaller amount or a small amount per year to have that, whereas other schools who perhaps don't need that service at that time not have to pay.
Yeah, I mean, we can take that on board. I mean, essentially these services are sort of like insurance, it's like pooled funds to try and support the sector.
Yeah.
And yes, sometimes situations are unplanned for, and then these services are then deployed to try and support schools and stabilise schools. But yeah, we can take
I
that.
think we're all in a position where we're cutting what we can where we can. So things like that, to have that option would be useful, I think.
Yeah. It's all up. Right then, so I think it's the three of you actually. Forgive me if I've missed anybody. So those in favour?
Can I ask a question?
Sorry, yeah, please, sorry.
Because you said primary.
Yes, the first proposal is just for primary
And
maintained.
that's what you're voting on.
And that's what they're
Right,
voting on
sorry.
now, and then we'll take questions and go on to the vote about maintained.
I'm just impact locality lead ones, Jolene, when you're here, I'll give you something to say. So the assessment for learning project, is that the lead driven?
It is,
Yes.
so that's a commission project with lead teaching school hub, so it's not a locality lead project.
That's over 4 years. Yes. How's it going?
Really well, and I think part of the, it only started last January, but the time that was taken to train the specialists so that they were absolutely ahead of the game, that if they are going in to support and to deliver that project, they have that understanding, depth of knowledge to be able to do so. And then that is also a resource that we'll be able to use beyond the project, and that's what's really important about it.
Thank you. So primary school representatives of maintained schools, then you're asked to agree to the proposals, the dedelegation of budgets, and then to support the arrangements for 27-28 as set out. Can just see a show of your hands, those of you in agreement. Thank you. And any of you against? That's 4 in favour there. None against. Thank you. Now, we're then going to talk about the maintained schools items. You're asking school forum, and again, it's just for maintained school representatives asked to agree for the services for the maintained schools budget period, 26-27, and then support the arrangements in principle for 27 and 28. I think we've got a question from Michelle first.
Yes, thank you. Mark, can you clarify, because when we originally discussed this at the forum, the per pupil allocation for audit was at point of audit, as I recall. So are we now suggesting that's an annual amount for every school, whether they're audited or not?
Yes, that's right. I think when there was a communication initially, we were working through the methodology of how we were going to recover the money to meet the costs of the services. Essentially through the services for maintained schools, a per pupil reduction can be made to support these type of activities. And we felt that was a more appropriate approach to do that for financial planning purposes, but also just to provide financial stability from the service, but also your to aid your financial planning as well. So this has been in place for the current financial year. So that has remained in place, and we'll look to propose it here to continue that in 26-27.
Okay.
So there won't be an additional cost during it's like what you're referring to in terms of when the audit comes. This is the pooled fund to support our being a team to deliver those services, of which you will receive an audit within every 3 years.
Okay.
Covering this breadth of.
And that money was put aside, expecting an audit, not that I'm inviting you, you get round to us when you're ready to. But when this was originally, when we went to the training, when all the maintained schools came across, and the question was asked, how much is an audit likely to cost? We were told, depending on school, somewhere between £3,000 and £6,000 per school. Yeah, I'm now looking over a 3-year basis at nearly £20,000 for an audit. The £6,180 is going to come out annually. So what has happened there for the school of my size, between what we were told in training, when all the maintained heads attended that we were estimated once every 3 years, £3,000 to £6,000, depending on the size of the school, to now £20,000 over 3 years.
Okay. So as part of our mechanisms, we're governed by the DFE in terms of how we recover monies. And so there's of which per pupil sum is the only factor that we can actually use. We would consider that to be a fair approach, bearing in mind size of schools. A bigger school will likely take a much greater depth and length of time to conclude such a comprehensive audit, which therefore there will be a greater cost levied to the bigger schools compared to that of the smaller schools. So essentially, that's how we were feeling that this being the appropriate approach. The other part of it is to make sure that every maintained school does undertake an audit with the service to deliver consistency and also the assurances from a local authority perspective, bear in mind that you are part of the local authority. So they were the two components that sort of were the drivers in terms of our sort of views and approach in terms of that. So it does represent how we considered the per pupil sum being a fairer approach across the board. Appreciate that.
Anything you've just said, don't dispute the per capita weighting. I don't dispute the process of audit. I don't dispute the accountability. What I'm questioning is the increase of the projection for a school of my size being probably £6,000 to now over a 3-year period being £20,000. Because at the time that we came to that training, I then investigated comparable private auditor costs and found out it would probably be somewhere around £6,000. But that's not what you're saying anymore. You're saying for a school of my size, I'm now over a 3-year period paying £20,000 for a once in 3 years. And what I would like to do, based on looking at appropriate delegation of public finances, I'd like to be able to look at whether I could do that privately, or are you telling me as a maintained head in a maintained school I can't do that privately, to have an audit of £20,000? And it won't just be me as a larger secondary school, and I recognise there are only 2 secondary schools that are maintained in the county. It's likely to also now be very large primary schools or groups of primary schools that would perhaps be able to get a better deal than the per capita cost.
Okay. I mean, so this is a not-for-profit service. This is just meeting the costs of the delivery across the sector. So that hopefully that sort of dispels anything there in terms of increases. We can have a look at the figures, but it is based on your. I'm surprised it's that much. So I haven't really seen your.
£6. You're saying £6.18 a child. I've got 1,000 children, and that will be every 3 years.
That's not including post 16. This is your 5 to 16 years.
Let's bring it down to £4,500 then. That's still then looking at £13,500, where the original. Am I the only one remembering this?
Well, yeah, but the numbers are worrying. Is this a disconnect between recovery of the audit costs and the delivery of the audit itself? Are you getting one every year?
No.
Right. Well, there's a disconnect there from the start. Because you're recovering on a yearly basis, but assuming you're going to have it.
So
every 3 years.
It's every 3 years. So we've costed the services of which we will be taking audit every 3 years. So we'll be taking, as an example, 150 schools. There'll be 50 undertaken, and that's the cost of delivering an audit of 50 schools. Yeah.
But it sounds like Michelle's paying for that cost every year.
Yes, it's a contribution every year. That's correct. Yes.
That's not a fair. Is that a fair basis then? Do it.
Yeah, it is.
You're supporting the audits of small schools.
Yes.
And so, I mean, we've got 300 children, so that's £1,800 a year over 3 years. That's close to £6,000 for an audit for us.
Yeah.
If that's the case, I think the report should reflect that, because it is very different to the head teacher training we had at Maintain Heads 2 or 3 years ago. And again, not to court any audit. I've been in post for 12 years and never been audited once.
Yeah.
So, not that I'm courting an audit, we have gold package and we're answerable to the local authority, but in an already stretched budget, what I had thought would be £6,000 once every 3 years, or £4,500 every 3 years, is now becoming 3 times that.
Yeah, I understand. I guess that's the challenge with the restrictions of a per pupil sum to recover the monies. but essentially the monies are there to support the delivery of those audits. It's a non-for-profit. It's there to deliver that. It's
Trying to
there
make
to
it
deliver that.
out, maintain schools.
But we could get better value for money if we went privately.
What it will mean is the increasing costs on the schools. Yeah.
And I think that if that's the principle, if this is a shared cost, that needs to be reflected in the report, because that's not, this is the point I'm taking issue with. That's not what the maintained heads were told 2.5 years ago when we were called to training.
Well, there's a schedule put in place for the audits, so you know when that will be, and all schools are billed at that time, but you know when that's going to come. So rather than expecting schools to book in their own audit and that happen, there is a schedule where that will.
I mean, essentially, this is the ease of administration, enables you to plan for it, and otherwise, it's going to create quite significant more administration as part of this overall process. But also, what I would say is, and I've been sort of stepping here in terms of governance arrangements. It has been reflected on in terms of in recent years, and we feel that actually stronger governance is needed across the schools. And I think this is something that's been drawn out from some of the audits. But essentially, this is to try and support improvements in overall governance, financial effectiveness, operational deliveries. It's there to support the schools, and we feel it's only right that we have reintroduce audit services across our maintained schools.
Again, Mark, I don't dispute what you're saying at all. But as a school with incredibly strong financial governance, I'm going to be meeting with them tomorrow night, telling them something very different to the original presentation of the audit that I shared with them when we had the training.
Can I just come in now, because I'm just aware of.
Sorry.
No. It's really good to have the discussion. You're making very valid points. I just want to interject to say, Mark, do we need to make a decision on this today?
Ideally, yes.
Ideally, yes. Okay. So I'm prepared to let the conversations go, then people to have their questions. I'm aware that we are talking to the maintained sector here, and you are going to need to vote whether you approve or not this. So sorry to interrupt, Michelle.
That's
we
okay.
will get to a vote today.
Well,
no.
Make my point
the
clear?
discussion is fine. It's absolutely. But what I was worried about was the questions you were having seemed to indicate you didn't have enough information.
No, and I think because of that, I can only abstain from the vote until I know a comparable cost to my school if I had alternatives for audit once every 3 years rather than this. And I don't even know, Mark and Martin, whether I'm allowed to do that as a maintained, or whether a maintained school, I've got to go with the auditing from the local authority. At the time of the presentation, we were told we could make alternative arrangements if we found that would equally satisfy the auditing process. But now looking at maybe £15,000, I want to be sure, as my governors will, so I would feel I'd have to abstain. But I don't want, I'm not speaking for all of the maintained primaries.
I can, sorry, but I can just come in there because I can answer the question that you've asked around whether you can engage with external service. So the short answer is yes, you can. However, when that discussion was had at that time, there was no de-delegated amount being charged. So individual schools would be given a price. We gave an average back in those discussions in October 24 about what that might look like. Obviously, it depends on the size of the school. It depends on the scope, the breadth and depth of testing required. So some of that is around your internal operational processes. There were cost efficiencies to be made for federations. So I can't sort of simplify it any more than that. What schools have not done is engage with the buyback service, which was previously in place. And what that meant is that we had very, very few schools that, as you've already alluded to yourselves, had been through any kind of audit experience. And the local authority has responsibilities to make sure that there is an adequate control environment in place. So those first conversations that were had were a separate conversation to the ones that we're having today, which were the audit committee determined that we needed to reintroduce a 3-year internal audit cycle as things stand at the moment, and that was rolled out. The per pupil delegations were a separate consideration, and in fact not one that we've been involved in. We are only here to wash our own face, as you say. We're not profit making in that sense. However, what that has done is add an extra layer of complexity in terms of those costs, because if you decide that you want to go on the de-delegated basis again, and I appreciate that's the decision that's not been made yet, you could still go to an external provider, but you'd then be paying twice effectively, so that there's no value to you in doing that at the moment. If the decision is made to not go down the de-delegated route, you absolutely can go to an external provider. What we would need to do is engage with you still to understand and ensure that the scope of the internal audit delivery is aligned with what requirements are for the Section 151 officer to satisfy themselves that the adequate control environment is in place. And that was what was discussed in those communications that happened in October 24, which I was on that call with Geraldine. So you might recall seeing me then. So the short answer is yes, you can go to an external provider, but if the de-delegation amount is approved, you can't opt out, as I understand it, Mark. And
it's an automatic deduction.
It's an automatic deduction, and therefore it would be you would be paying twice for a service.
Michelle, if you're, surely your audit though would take more work than say a smaller school. Surely the audit would have more days. And I've recently been audited, and at the risk of dropping myself in it here, but we've just recently been audited, and I would have sat with you on and said we had really strong governance. Turns out we didn't have quite the strong governance as I thought we did. And we've paid in per pupil as well. But the beauty of that, I guess, is the fact they now have to come back again. So you'd end up having to pay twice, I guess, if something came up and then they had to come back again.
I think my opinion has probably been coloured by the fact that I also run an academy and know that the amount I pay for the audit.
Yes, I understand. Yeah.
But it seems as though I haven't got any autonomy over the decision anyway, because it's going to be taken whether I vote yes or not. So
No, it's subject to the approval.
That's
right.
Absolutely. It's a decision. It's a genuine decision.
When did this?
Sorry, can I just
change?
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Sorry, my apologies.
Abby, sorry,
Abby, thank you for your clarity on that. Just before you finish, I was just going to follow your comments, which were helpful explanation. How often are you expecting maintained schools to be audited?
As things stand at the moment, in line with the approval of the audit committee, once every 3 years.
Once every 3 years.
Once every 3 years, absolutely. And
So
in actual
the
fact,
comments about not being audited in 12 years or 8 years would be surprised by it.
well, that won't happen under the current.
Going forward.
For want of a better word, regime.
That's fine.
Approved by the audit committee.
Thank you.
And just to touch on the point that Jeanette made, who, as you say, has recently had audit, as was Laura actually, the number of schools that are having an assurance rating below adequate is around about 30% as things stand since the start of the delivery. So the control environment is not where it needs to be in quite a number of schools. Those schools that have had an adequate assurance rating issued are still also attracting high and medium risk findings as well. So that's where the overall control environment is deemed to be adequate, but there are still high risks identified as part of that testing programme. Now, at the moment, the testing programme that's being delivered is the same across all schools, because it's almost for consistency reasons. It might be that initial 3 year cycle that we adopt more of a risk-based approach, which might mean that the testing profile is slightly different, but that's for the audit committee to determine, obviously closer to the time.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you. Mark, sorry. Can I go for Mark first, then I'll come back.
So there's obviously a change, because my understanding was we were going to pay as we go. And you're already doing audits at the moment, so they're being paid for somehow. But now this is shifted, our heads at the wheel. I wasn't personally aware of that. Does it mean?
Provide some clarity. So during the summer period, that's when the decision from the audit committee and the local authority wanted stronger governance in the school sector, maintain school sector. So Abby and the team obviously engaged with the sector, and then it was then about reflecting about how we can administer the money side of things in terms of the support delivery costs. We came to the schools forum in November of 24, and that's when the decision was taken by the sector members here, maintain school sector members, to the per pupil reduction. So this is in place now. This has been in place in this current year, which started in April. So there's been no additional charges to the schools that have undertaken an audit relating to a core audit that's been undertaken. So, and this is essentially what we're seeking today is a continuation of the current system that's in place at the moment. So in your budgets in this current year, you received a deduction in your budgets to support the audit team's costs.
Forgive me, I have no recollection of that whatsoever, but we are where we are.
Any other points? Yes, Bill.
Sorry, Chair. Unfortunately, my colleague and I need to go because we've got Department for Education meeting.
Quite understand. I was going to give you an opportunity to address today. Did you want to? This is you're not voting on this one anyway.
No.
Right. Thank you very much.
Apologies, everyone.
I will give other colleagues a chance to break for it as well after this, but we need to get to a vote. Now, any other question before we go to a vote then? This is just for maintained school representatives. So you are being asked, number one, to agree for services for maintained school budgets for the period 26-27. We'll take that item before we go on to two. So if you're in favour of that, can you raise your hand, please?
No, it's.
Going to vote or not vote? I don't recall the call.
Abstain.
Yeah. I don't recall this.
Okay, you got those. Thank you. Anyone voting against? Anyone abstaining? Okay, thank you very much. And then supporting the arrangements in principle for 27-28. All those in favour, please. Any votes against? And any abstentions on that?
That one I am going to abstain from because I want to find out more information.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, my apologies for my appalling chairmanship. We have already exceeded 3 o'clock, and that's when we said we were going to finish. I am proposing that if we call it, we will carry on, but if you need to go now to other commitments, this would be your opportunity, and Josh, thank you. Dr. Van Der's meeting. Yeah, no problem. You go to West Yorkshire. Good luck. Safe travel. You need to go. Okay, if you need to go, then go now. Otherwise, to Geraldine. We're going to go to you. Okay, so in the interest of time, again, could you please, officers, thank you for your report. But you have circulated them in advance. We know you've seen them. We don't read them to us, and let's pick out particular things that we get the action of the meeting.
As the timetable was ticking away, I kept going through my notes and highlighting and removing. But as you just said, Tristan, everybody has received the report. I just wanted to really draw your attention to some highlights and maybe some lowlights, but it is just for noting. So as a county, we have risen through our link tables and our most vulnerable children outperform their peers nationally. And the mix of school types that we have in the county provides a rich and diverse framework for education for our children. Pleased that the phonics screening check, although Lincolnshire is still slightly behind national outcomes over time, have shown a faster improvement than other regions, and this includes for disadvantaged and pupils with SEND. At Key Stage 2, again, the performance of disadvantaged pupils in the combined measure of reading, writing and maths, we were pleased to see an increase of 3%. Nevertheless, Lincolnshire still needs to improve the statutory tested performance in reading and maths, where our disadvantaged cohort have the lowest performance compared to our comparators. Key Stage 4, 63%, achieved grade 4, the standard pass or above in both English and maths, which is below national but above statistical. Just want to now provide a brief update on the highlights in the Lincolnshire sector-led system, so from page 51. Lincolnshire Education Group continues to work together to strategically drive education improvement in Lincolnshire. It's important to note that the sector includes all those organisations which have an interest in the well-being and education of children and young people. It's also important to recognise that our schools and settings have a responsibility for driving their own organisational improvement within the sector of education as a whole. However, Lincolnshire's Education Group Strategic One Plan for 25-26 has been aligned with the DFE priorities for the East Midlands. And this has been shared with you as an appendices and with all school leaders and CEOs of multi-academy trusts, with the aim that there is a shared collective focus on the priorities and that they underpin school and academy improvement plans. Previously, the Schools Forum supported proposals to use DSG underspends to support sector-led work, and this has been utilised to implement the projects that have been outlined in the paper. With the Leadership Development Project, I think everybody here, regardless of your role, it's recognised that leadership is fundamental to a successful school, and the Leadership Project was aimed to inspire, develop, nurture and connect leaders across Lincolnshire, adding value to the already existing wealth of knowledge, skills and expertise, and really with the aim of untapping that skills and the wealth of knowledge. As part of the Leadership Project, specialist development programmes have been delivered to meet the needs of the range of leadership across Lincolnshire. And in particular, a leadership mentoring programme has been devised and implemented to support those who are new to role as head teachers in Lincolnshire. Not necessarily new head teachers, but we know Lincolnshire may work differently to Nottinghamshire, and other local authorities are available. So it's important that all the leaders that are new to Lincolnshire know how we work in Lincolnshire, particularly with the sector-led school improvement focus. And that takes place alongside the forum to support and develop newly appointed leaders and has received overwhelmingly positive feedback. Additionally, additional locality lead capacity has been established with a particular focus on leadership support and development in maintained schools, and this is in addition to locality lead roles. And since introduction in July 24, 25 schools have benefited from a time-limited, specific, targeted support with a focus on effective leadership. This has involved support for governors, head teachers and other senior leaders where there's been an identified area for improvement. And there has been a very positive impact on leadership overall. As part of the sector-led commitment of Lincolnshire County Council continues to provide leadership briefings to all leaders 3 times a year. And the Leadership Development Forum has been developed as part of the Leadership Project to facilitate and nurture leadership across Lincolnshire. Pleased to report an increased attendance at these briefings and at those forums, with 100% of attendees reporting their usefulness and impact within schools. There is a sustained engagement and increased participation in specific district areas. And although representation from some multi-academy trusts continues to be lower, support and challenge through the Lincolnshire Education Group has led to increased attendance and meaningful engagement. The Gainsborough Aspiration Project was introduced as a locality-based project to bring leaders of all Gainsborough schools together to agree a shared vision, mission and strategy for education to improve educational outcomes for all pupils in the area. And I'm pleased to say this has been able to extend to its 4th year with additional resource from the District Council. The project, working in partnership with the district and local authority and community partners, has continued to go from strength to strength, and a number of positive outcomes have been outlined in the report. And the impact of that locality-based project has been significant in its learning, particularly around partnership working. In Gainsborough, that's now embedded, and following that success, a Skegness Aspiration Project has been initiated. Lead Teaching School Hub continues to work strategically in partnership with the local authority and partners to ensure there is joined up working and to respond to the needs of the sector is strong and is positively impacting on quality of education and ultimately outcomes for people in Lincolnshire. In conclusion, the service that the local authority provides in partnership with the Lincolnshire Education Group, the sector and the Teaching School Hub remains an essential and effective provision in the landscape of education and led school improvement. Summarised.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Geraldine or comments?
On your Key Stage 2 bit, It says disadvantaged cohort of the lowest performance compared to other comparators. In the next sentence, it says disadvantage and send pupils continue to do well compared to
So that's
others.
together, disadvantage and sending HCP.
So it should say disadvantage with SEM,
Thank you
maybe.
very much.
Thank you. It would be helpful just note that the KPIs, if they were to come into a table, be easy to kind of scan across, because that's really what you're referring to. There isn't it, KPIs across the sector, which is fundamentally why we're all here. Thanks very much. Any other comments or questions? Okay, Geraldine, thank you very much for your report. We've noted the contents, thank you. So if we could go to back to you, Mark, academies and trust update.
It's actually going to be me this time.
Oh, sorry.
No, not a problem at all. I will be very quick on this. So this is a report that comes to each forum meeting that provides an update in terms of the split between maintained schools and academies. So since the this is the position as of the 1st of January, since the last report, 2 additional primary schools have now converted to academy, and the split between schools and academies is detailed at the bottom of page 57 going on to page 58. At the moment, there are no further dates for schools going academy, so the 6-month projection is the same as the current projection. Page 59 details some movement of some academies within some different trusts. And the academy trust with the most Lincolnshire academies is in the middle of page 59. The report then goes to the position of multi-academy trusts and single academy trusts in Lincolnshire, and the split between those per sector is detailed at the bottom of page 59. And then very finally, on page 60, it details the largest academies nationally operating in Lincolnshire and a number of Lincolnshire schools in those academy trusts.
Very much. Got any questions or comments on the report? Summarised very effectively there. I think my only comment would, I don't want to rehash the discussions of the previous agenda items, but just that with more and more schools in the academy sector, I think knowledge of how those schools are audited, for example, and the costs associated, and then being able to then position to maintain schools, and this is how much it would cost if you went out, and also internally to make sure you can keep your own auditing costs sharp. And I think that was one of the big learnings from when academisation programme initially started, is that schools didn't always understand those things that they'd be liable for and how much they would cost outside of the maintained sector, sometimes costing more and sometimes costing less. So it'd just be raising the point really that maybe there are some avenues there for officers to get into, you know, those costs associated with running those schools.
Can I just come in there, Christian, please? So I think completely hear and understand the points of running the service through the audit offer, if you like. I think when it comes to benchmarking or seeking alternative costings, that would be for the school to explore.
Yeah, it wasn't my point. The reason I was thinking is we did hear from some members saying, could we go outside? Yeah. And I think actually it's understanding that, both for schools, but also for local authority officers to understand.
And I think that is, there is something around the comms and doing that. I just want to make the difference there if we were going to, because I think Michelle, Michelle, you were talking around benchmarking, and how does that benchmark against other offers of audit? I suppose, and that's the bit where it's tricky for a local authority to check without going out to the market, and we wouldn't go out to the market because we've got an LCC offer. If that makes sense.
I can perhaps add a little bit of, share a little bit of information. We do actually work with Gap Academies. Obviously, that's a chargeable service. Yes. So we're currently working with 13 different academies. Most of those are single academy trusts, but we do work with one medium-sized one as well. Now, academies must have an internal audit function. It's a requirement of the ATH. However, some of the, particularly the larger academies, will have their own internal quality assurance processes. So it's very difficult for us to benchmark costs against that because they will have that in-house. They obviously can seek sort of external services, and quite a number of them come to us locally because there isn't actually a lot available in the local area. There are some services, but there's not a lot out there. But the governing body sets their own agenda for what they want the scope of the testing to be. That will be based on their responses within to the ESFA or DFE as it now is, but it will also be based on what's in their risk register and what their risk appetite is. So testing programmes vary. So we work with academy schools. We might only be delivering an audit over 2.5 days, or we might be delivering a full academy audit programme over 7 or 8 days, depending on the size of the school. So it's difficult to have a direct sort of comparison. And as I say, a lot of the bigger MATs will have their own internal sort of delivery in place as well.
Okay, thank you. Michelle.
Thank you. I suppose it's because I have a very unique experience of leading both a maintained school and a single academy trust that I've seen how both sides operate there. My point of context isn't about the process, it's about knowing the cost is coming out of my budget. I've fished through the minutes, and I do recall being at that meeting because it was when it was announced that Ken Durand had sadly passed away. However, within the minutes, it does very clearly say to fulfil this duty, a budget of 0.170 million will be required with an indicative cost of £5.57 per pupil. It was further noted that a temporary reduction in school audit costs would be applied to primary maintained schools for 25-26. And within the minutes, there is nothing about secondary maintained schools, which is possibly why it didn't register with me when I read the report or when we had those discussions. But it specifically says the cost will be applied to primary, not secondary.
No, so this was about the actual rate itself would actually be reduced in the first year for primary schools, and essentially that would be reduced through use of the reserve. So within the delegation report that I've just remarked on, talked about an 82,000 contribution from the reserve to meet the cost for the primary schools. That delegation reserve is solely for primaries, hence why we can only apply a reduction in that year one relating to that sector only. But the full cost in itself was applied for both specials and secondary.
Sure. Okay. And
Can I just pick up from this report, ask the question? You've had 2 conversions, it appears. Are any of the existing academies being rebrokered?
Yes. Well,
2 are.
but they're already in the academy system.
Yeah.
So there are 2 academies that are eligible for intervention from the regional director's office, and one is in track, and one has got to take another pathway through finding a new multi-academy trust. So it had a potential, but then it's
Possible to update the report in future with
So it does happen. So when that actually does take place, the report writer does make that amendment in the context of the narrative. Yeah.
Thank you.
So they'll be noted in future reports.
It already is for those that have actually completed. So where it has actually been completed and moved, it is.
when it's
No, I think are you saying you've incorporated into the figures?
No, the figures are correct.
Yes, but I think
narrative
that needs to be updated.
No. The narrative is only updated when the actual change has taken place.
Oh, I see. So it's in the plan.
So
Yeah.
we can't speculate in terms of
Sure.
where it's going. So I reports are updated.
it'll be
It
a
will
actual
be.
notification that says,
Yeah.
such and such school has moved from this to this trust. But it will be done in completion rather than before,
Yeah.
or jeopardising any determinations by the RD's office.
That's clear.
Which it says on 59, just below that table, page 59, it talks about there some movement of some academies into different trusts.
And they're the ones that have.
And they're the ones that have happened. So it talks about C for Cars Grammar, C for Stephen going into CIT, and Stanford St Gilbert's joining the Anglican Trust. So those are the ones that will have now moved one to another.
Any other questions or comments on the report? Okay, thank you very much for that. Yes, we've noted that report too. So we've got the work programme, agenda item 10. Any comments on this? You put this together, Rachel.
Yeah, it's Mark.
Mark, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, this is the current work plan. So open to comments. I mean, clearly what we've built in our core items, but also anticipating the SEND reforms, and obviously we'll be looking to bring a summary of that together for consideration and understanding what that means locally for us.
Yeah, that's it.
But yeah, if there's any other sort of type of agendas that you feel relating to financial arrangements, which is obviously what the forum's about, so if there's anything you feel that you would like to see added, then please reach out to me.
Any comments or suggestions for the future work programme, future agendas? I don't know if it's possible. Can we run I don't know if we run a timed agenda for this. It might help kind of just sharpen how we move through. I don't know if that would be possible with officers. And if we get all the papers, at least a week in advance, then again, if people have read that, I'm just aware of people's time. I think that would help if that's possible.
Of course, I think just in terms of sort of the to follow items, unfortunately, it's with the late government announcements, holiday time, it left our.
No, I appreciate that, and
to review and.
I appreciate that, but I think that's one of the reasons it's kind of taken longer today to get through when people are kind of reading this with a few of the items with less notice. Okay, is there any other business? Anyone? Okay, thank you all very much for your time and attention today. Thank you for the discussions, rich discussions. Certainly provoke more meeting together than online perhaps, but thank you officers for your reports as well. Okay. We'll close the meeting.